The humid Florida evening of August the 17th, 1989, hung heavy over the Everglades like a suffocating blanket. The air shimmered with heat even after sunset, and the chorus of cicadas and bullfrogs created an almost deafening symphony in the vast wetlands surrounding the remote Tamiami Trail. Sarah Martinez, 23, and her boyfriend David Chen, 25, had been driving back from a romantic weekend at a secluded cabin near Lake Okeechobee when their 1987 red Honda Civic simply disappeared into the night. The couple had been together for 2 years, both working as environmental science graduate students at the University of Miami, passionate about conservation and blissfully unaware that their research into illegal dumping in the Everglades had caught the attention of very dangerous. Their last known location was captured by a traffic camera at 9:47 p.m. as they passed through the small town of Okeechobee. David's arm casually draped around Sarah's shoulder as she drove, both of them laughing at something on the radio. The stretch of road where they vanished was a desolate 15-mile corridor cutting through the heart of the Everglades National Park, flanked by endless sawgrass marshes and cypress domes that stretched to the horizon. Ancient alligators lurked in the black water channels that crisscrossed the landscape veins, while panthers and black bears roamed the higher hammocks dotted with royal palms and strangler fig. The asphalt was cracked and weathered, with only occasional mile markers breaking the monotony of the wilderness, and cell phone coverage was virtually non-existent in 1989. Abandoned airboat tours and fishing camps dotted the area, many of them fronts for less legitimate activities that thrived in the lawless remoteness of the swamp. The nearest gas station was 20 miles in either direction, and the few locals who lived in the scattered trailer parks and fishing villages along the trail knew better than to ask questions about the occasional late-night convoys of unmarked trucks rumbled through the darkness. When Sarah and David failed to arrive at their apartment by midnight, Sarah's roommate Jennifer initially assumed they had decided to extend their romantic getaway by another night. But by noon the following day, with no answer to repeated phone calls and no sign of the distinctive red Honda in their usual parking spot, Jennifer's concern transformed into genuine alarm. She contacted both sets of parents, who immediately drove down from their respective homes in Gainesville and Tampa, their faces etched with the kind of worry that only comes when you know something is fundamentally wrong. The couple were responsible, punctual people who never failed to communicate their whereabouts, especially to Sarah's overprotective mother, who had reluctantly given her blessing to the relationship despite her concerns about Sarah dating outside their tight-knit Cuban-American community. By evening, when a call to the local hospitals yielded no information and a check with the county jail came up empty, the families knew they were dealing with something far more serious than a simple breakdown or minor accident. The initial police response was frustratingly routine and dismissive, handled by Officer Marcus Webb of the Collier County Sheriff's Office, a man whose gut had grown soft from too many years of easy desk duty in what was supposed to be a quiet rural posting. Webb filled out the standard missing persons report with obvious boredom, suggesting that the young couple had probably just decided to elope to Key West or gotten into a lover's quarrel and would turn up in a few days looking sheepish and his condescending attitude infuriated Sarah's father, Roberto Martinez, a successful construction worker who had built his business from nothing and wasn't accustomed to being brushed off by lazy bureaucrats. The families demanded a proper search, but Webb insisted that protocol required waiting 48 hours before treating it as anything more than a routine runaway case, despite their protests that these were responsible graduate students, not flighty teenagers. Little did anyone know that Officer Webb's casual dismissal was not mere incompetence, but the first deliberate obstruction in what would become a decades-long cover-up orchestrated by people who had already decided that Sarah Martinez and David Chen would never be found. The red Honda Civic was discovered 3 days later by a park ranger conducting a routine patrol along a service road deep in the Everglades, approximately 8 miles from the main highway, down a barely passable dirt track that most tourists would never venture onto. The car sat abandoned in a small clearing surrounded by towering cypress trees draped with Spanish moss, its doors unlocked and keys still dangling from the ignition, as if the occupants had simply stepped out for a moment and planned to Sarah's purse lay on the passenger seat, her wallet containing $127 in cash and all her credit cards untouched, while David's camera bag sat in the back seat with expensive equipment still intact. The only signs of disturbance were two sets of footprints leading away from the vehicle toward a boat launch barely visible through the thick vegetation, though the soft ground made it impossible to determine if the prints had been made voluntarily or under duress. Most puzzling of all, the car's gas tank was nearly full, ruling out the possibility that they had simply run out of fuel and decided to walk for help. There was no evidence of mechanical failure or collision damage anywhere on the vehicle. The discovery of the abandoned car transformed the case from a missing persons report into a potential criminal investigation, but the response from local law enforcement remained sluggish and seemingly incompetent in ways that would later prove to be anything but accidental. The crime scene was contaminated almost immediately when multiple officers tramped through the area without proper documentation, and crucial evidence like tire tracks from other vehicles and potential fingerprints on the car's exterior were lost through sloppy police work that bordered on deliberate sabotage. Detective Ray Castellanos, a veteran investigator with the Miami-Dade Police Department, who had been called in by the families, arrived to find that the scene had been so compromised that any serious forensic analysis was virtually impossible. The boat launch showed signs of recent use, with fresh scrape on the concrete ramp and oil stains in the water, but by the time Marine Patrol units arrived to search the surrounding waterways, any physical evidence had been washed away by the flow of the. Even more frustratingly, the missing persons case had somehow been transferred between 3 different jurisdictions, creating a bureaucratic maze that allowed crucial evidence to disappear and witnesses to vanish before they could be properly interviewed. Detective Ray Castellanos spent the better part of 1990 chasing ghosts through the labyrinthine world of South Florida's criminal underworld, following leads that seemed promising but inevitably dissolved into nothing more than rumors and dead ends. His investigation revealed that Sarah and David had indeed been researching illegal dumping practices in the Everglades as part of their graduate thesis, focusing specifically on industrial waste disposal that violated federal environmental protection laws and could potentially expose major construction to massive law and criminal charges. The young couple had been methodically documenting evidence of contaminated soil samples, mysterious chemical burns on vegetation, and unusual fish kills in areas where legitimate businesses should never have been operating, building a case that could have destroyed several influential careers and cost certain powerful individuals millions of dollars in fines and cleanup costs. Their research had brought them into contact with environmental activists, whistleblowing employees from various industries, and even a few reformed smugglers who had decided to cooperate with federal authorities in exchange for reduced sentences on unrelated charges. But every potential witness that Castellanos attempted to interview had either disappeared, suddenly developed amnesia about their previous statements, or turned up dead in circumstances that were ruled accidental by coroners who seemed remarkably incurious about the suspicious timing of these fatalities. The families of the missing couple refused to accept the official assumption that Sarah and David had simply gotten lost in the Everglades and succumbed to the harsh environment, despite reassurances from various officials that such disappearances were unfortunately common in the treacherous wilderness of South Florida. Roberto Martinez hired a private investigator, former FBI agent Patricia Hayes, who had built a reputation for solving cold cases that local police departments had given up on, but even her extensive resources and contacts proved inadequate against the wall of silence that seemed to surround every aspect of the investigation. Hayes discovered that several key pieces of evidence from the crime scene had mysteriously vanished from the police evidence locker, including photographs of tire tracks, soil samples from around the abandoned car, and even the couple's personal belongings that should have been preserved for analysis. When she attempted to interview Officer Marcus Webb about his initial handling of the case, she found that he had suddenly taken early retirement and moved to an undisclosed location somewhere in the Carolinas, leaving behind only a forwarding address that led to an empty post office box. The bureaucratic obstacles became so numerous and obviously deliberate that Hayes began to suspect the involvement of organized crime with connections deep inside law enforcement, but proving such corruption would require evidence that seemed to have been systematically destroyed or hidden beyond her reach. As the months turned into years, the case developed the frustrating characteristics of investigation that have been professionally sabotaged from within the system itself. Witness statements were lost or misfiled. Forensic evidence disappeared or became contaminated through mysterious storage accidents, and key investigators were suddenly transferred to other departments or found themselves facing internal affairs investigations for unrelated matters that effectively removed them from. Detective Castellanos, who had built his career on methodical attention to detail and relentless pursuit of justice, found himself dealing with superiors who seemed more interested in closing the case than solving it, suggesting that the department's resources would be better spent on crimes with more promising leads. The official theory gradually shifted toward the assumption that Sarah and David had been the victims of a random encounter with drug smugglers or other criminals who used the remote Everglades as a base of operation, killed them to eliminate potential witnesses, and disposed of their bodies in the vast wilderness where they would never be found. This explanation satisfied the bureaucratic need for closure while conveniently avoiding any investigation into the systematic corruption that had allowed the real perpetrators to operate with impunity for years, protected by a network of compromised officials who ensured that anyone getting too close to the truth would find their careers derailed or their personal safety threatened. The emotional toll on the families was devastating, transforming their grief into a consuming obsession with finding answers that seemed to recede further into the distance with each passing year. Sarah's mother, Maria Martinez, developed severe depression and had to be hospitalized twice after suffering nervous breakdowns triggered by the anniversary dates of her daughter's disappearance and the discovery of the abandoned car. David's parents, successful immigrants who had built a prosperous medical practice in Tampa, found their marriage strained to the breaking point as they disagreed about whether to continue pursuing expensive private investigations or accept that they might never know what happened to their son. Roberto Martinez channeled his grief into a relentless campaign for justice, spending his construction company's profits on hiring investigators, offering rewards for information, and lobbying politicians to pressure law enforcement agencies into keeping the case active. But his efforts seemed to accomplish nothing more than attracting the attention of people who made it clear that his continued pursuit of the truth was not appreciated. The families formed a support group with other parents of missing persons, but their case stood out for the obvious signs of official obstruction and the systematic way that evidence had been made to disappear, leading some of the other families to distance themselves out of fear that association with the Martinez and Chen cases might jeopardize their own searches for missing loved ones. By 1995, the active investigation had been quietly shelved despite the families' protests, relegated to the status of a cold case that would only be revisited if new evidence emerged through some external development that the authorities could not ignore or suppress. Detective Castellanos had been promoted to a supervisory position that kept him away from field investigation. Patricia Hayes had exhausted her leads and could no longer justify the expense of pursuing what seemed to be an unsolvable mystery, and the media attention that briefly focused national attention on the case had moved on to more recent tragedy, with clearer villains and more satisfying resolution. The official files contained hundreds of pages of reports, witness statements, and forensic analyses that painted a picture of thorough police work. But anyone reading between the lines could see the gaps where crucial information should have been, the inconsistencies in witness that suggested coaching or intimidation, and the remarkable frequency evidence had been lost or destroyed through clerical errors and storage. The case became a cautionary tale whispered among honest cops and federal agents about what happened when investigations threatened the wrong people, but it also served as a successful demonstration to other potential witnesses that cooperation with law enforcement offered no protection against retribution from criminals with friends in high places. The passage of time brought changes in law enforcement leadership, technological advances in forensic science, and shifts in the political landscape that might have created opportunities to reopen the investigation with better prospects for success. New DNA analysis techniques could potentially extract useful information from evidence that had been considered worthless in 1989. Enhanced database systems could identify connections between seemingly unrelated cases, and federal task forces focused on organized crime had developed more sophisticated methods for penetrating criminal organizations and protecting witnesses who agreed to cooperate. But the Sarah Martinez and David Chen case remained buried in the bureaucratic equivalent of witness protection, its files transferred to inactive storage, where they gathered dust alongside thousands of other unsolved cases that represented failures of the justice system to protect its most vulnerable citizens. The families continued their vigil, gathering every year on the anniversary of the disappearance to hold candlelight memorials and renew their public appeals for information, but their numbers dwindled as relatives aged and died without ever learning the truth about what happened to their children in the dark waters of the Everglades humid night. In 1998, the investigation experienced a brief revival when a convicted drug smuggler named Tommy Vasquez claimed from his federal prison cell that he had information about the missing couple, offering to trade details about their fate in exchange for a reduced sentence on his trafficking charges. Vasquez spun an elaborate tale about witnessing Sarah and David being murdered by rival smugglers who had mistaken them for undercover DEA agents, providing specific details about the location where their bodies had allegedly been dumped, and even describing personal items that only the real killers could have known about. FBI agent Linda Morrison, who had recently been assigned to review cold cases involving missing persons, spent 3 months following up on Vasquez's, organizing expensive search operations in the areas he specified and bringing in specialized equipment to scan the murky waters of remote canals for any trace of human remains. The searches turned up nothing but decades-old debris, remains of various animals, while forensic analysis of items that Vasquez claimed belonged to the victims proved that they had never been in contact with either Sarah or David. When confronted with evidence his story was fabricated, Vasquez eventually admitted that he had concocted the entire narrative based on newspaper and jailhouse rumors, hoping to manipulate his way into a more comfortable prison assignment. But the false lead had consumed valuable resources and raised false hopes among family members who had dared to believe that answers were finally within reach. The Vasquez incident established a pattern that would repeat itself numerous times over the following years as various criminals and attention seekers came forward with bogus confessions and fabricated evidence, each hoping to gain some advantage from their association with a case that had received significant media coverage. A homeless man in Key West claimed that he had helped bury the couple's bodies in a construction that was later developed into a shopping mall, providing hand-drawn maps and detailed descriptions that sent investigators on another futile mission that cost taxpayers thousands of dollars in excavation costs. A woman serving time for fraud insisted that her ex-boyfriend had bragged about killing college students in the Everglades, offering to wear a wire and extract a confession if authorities would arrange for her early release, but surveillance revealed that the man she accused serving a prison sentence in another state at the time. Each false lead was treated seriously by investigators who could not afford to ignore any potential breakthrough. But the pattern of deliberate misinformation suggested that someone was actively encouraging these fabricated stories as a way to discredit the investigation and exhaust the resources of law enforcement agencies that might otherwise stumble across genuine evidence. The families found themselves riding an emotional roller coaster of hope and despair, never knowing whether the latest development would finally provide answers or turn out to be another cruel hoax designed to prolong their suffering. Detective Castellanos, despite his promotion to administrative duties, continued to monitor the case unofficially, using his connections throughout Florida law enforcement to track down rumors and investigate tips that came through various channels. His personal files on the case grew to encompass hundreds of leads that had never been properly followed up by the official investigation, including suspicious financial transactions, unusual business partnerships, and personnel changes in various government agencies that coincided with key developments. Castellanos began to identify patterns that suggested a sophisticated operation designed to protect specific individuals from exposure, with evidence disappearing at crucial moments and key witnesses being intimidated or eliminated before they could provide damaging testimony. His unofficial investigation revealed connections between several major construction companies, environmental consulting firms, and political figures who had financial interests in development projects that would have been jeopardized by the kind of environmental research that Sarah and David had been conducting. But every time Castellanos thought he was close to identifying the specific individuals responsible for the couple's disappearance, his inquiries would trigger warnings from his superiors about exceeding his authority and interfering with ongoing federal investigation that supposedly had jurisdiction. The technological advances of the late 1990s and early 2000s offered new possibilities for analyzing old evidence, but somehow the crucial physical evidence from the Sarah Martinez and David Chen case proved to be unavailable for re-examination. The car had been released to a salvage after the initial forensic analysis and had subsequently been sold, making it impossible to conduct more sophisticated tests for DNA evidence or trace materials that might have been overlooked by the primitive techniques available in 1980. Photographs from the crime scene had been stored on deteriorating film stock that had been improperly maintained, resulting in images that were too degraded to reveal details that might have been visible with enhanced digital processing. Even the couple's personal belongings should have been preserved as evidence had somehow been contaminated through storage problems, mixed with evidence from other cases, or simply lost during department reorganizations that coincidentally occurred whenever new investigators showed renewed interest in pursuing the case. The systematic destruction of evidence was so thorough and well-timed that it could not have been accidental, suggesting that someone with detailed knowledge of police procedures and access to evidence storage facilities had been methodically eliminating anything that might eventually lead to the truth about what happened on the night of August 17, 1989. The psychological impact of the prolonged investigation began to take its toll on everyone involved, including law enforcement officers who knew they were being prevented from doing their jobs effectively by forces beyond their control. Several detectives who had worked on the case requested transfers to other departments, citing frustration with the lack of cooperation from supervisors and the suspicious way that evidence seemed to disappear whenever they made progress in their investigation. FBI agent Morrison, who had initially approached the cold case review with optimism, potential for new forensic techniques to solve old mysteries, found herself questioning whether federal law enforcement was truly independent from the corruption that seemed to permeate every aspect of the case at the local and state level. The family's private investigator, Patricia Hayes, began receiving anonymous threats that made it clear someone was monitoring her activities and considered her continued involvement in the case to be a serious threat to their security. These intimidation tactics were subtle but effective, designed to create an atmosphere of fear and paranoia that would discourage anyone from pursuing the investigation too aggressively, while maintaining plausible deniability for the people who were orchestrating the cover-up. As the 10-year anniversary of the disappearance approached in 1999, media attention briefly focused on the case again, with newspaper articles and television news segments highlighting the lack of progress in solving what had become one of Florida's most notorious unsolved mysteries. The renewed publicity generated hundreds of tips from the public, but investigation revealed that most of these were either rehashed versions of information that had already been thoroughly investigated or obvious hoaxes submitted by people seeking attention or reward money. A few tips seemed genuinely promising, including reports from several independent sources about suspicious activity at various locations throughout the Everglades during the time period when Sarah and David disappeared. But follow-up investigations were hampered by the same bureaucratic obstacles and evidence problems that had plagued the case from the beginning. The media attention also attracted the interest of true crime writers and documentary filmmakers who wanted to tell the story of the missing couple, but their research requests were denied by law enforcement agencies that cited ongoing investigation concerns, and several journalists who attempted to pursue independent research found themselves facing legal obstacles and professional difficulties that effectively ended their involvement in the project. The 10th anniversary memorial service organized by the families drew hundreds of supporters, but it also marked the point at which many observers began to accept that Sarah Martinez and David Chen would join the ranks of missing persons whose cases would never be solved, their fate destined to remain one of the Everglades' dark secrets. By 2005, advances in federal investigations into organized crime began to reveal the existence of a sophisticated network that had been operating in South Florida for decades, using environmental crimes as a cover for much larger criminal enterprises, including money laundering, political corruption, and the elimination of witnesses who threatened to expose their Operation Everglades, a joint task force comprising FBI agents, EPA investigators, and IRS financial crimes specialists, had initially focused on illegal dumping and construction, but gradually uncovered evidence of a criminal organization that had infiltrated multiple levels of government and law enforcement throughout the region. The investigation revealed that several major construction were paying millions of dollars in bribes to politicians, judges, and police officials to ensure that their illegal disposal of hazardous waste in protected wetlands would never be prosecuted, and that this corruption network had become so extensive that it essentially controlled environmental enforcement throughout much of South Florida. Wiretaps and financial records obtained through federal search warrants painted a picture of an organization that viewed murder as a routine business expense, with professional killers on the payroll to eliminate anyone who posed a threat to their lucrative operation. The scale of the corruption was staggering, involving dozens of public officials who had been purchased outright, and hundreds of others who had been compromised through blackmail, financial incentives, or threats against their families. The criminal network operated through a series of legitimate businesses that provided perfect cover for their illegal activities, including construction companies that specialized in large-scale development projects in environmentally sensitive areas, waste management firms that charged premium prices for proper disposal while actually dumping toxic materials in remote locations, and environmental consulting companies that produced fraudulent reports to help their clients obtain permits for projects that should never have been approved. At the center of the organization was Vincent the Swamp Torino, a third-generation organized crime figure who had recognized that environmental crimes offered much higher profits and lower risk than traditional rackets like gambling and loan sharking. Torino had built his empire by corrupting the regulatory system from within, placing his associates in key positions throughout state and federal agencies, while using his legitimate businesses to generate massive profits from both legal contracts and illegal dumping operations. His organization employed sophisticated methods to identify and eliminate threats to their operation, including surveillance of environmental activists, infiltration of academic research projects, and the systematic corruption of law enforcement officers who might otherwise investigate reports of illegal activity. The network had become so powerful that it could orchestrate the disappearance of troublesome individuals, confident that the resulting investigations would be sabotaged by their confederates in position authority. Intelligence gathered through Operation Everglades revealed that Sarah Martinez and David Chen had unknowingly stumbled into the middle of one of Torino's most sensitive operations, a massive illegal dumping scheme that was generating millions of dollars in profits while contaminating thousands of acres of protected wetland with industrial waste that would remain toxic for centuries. Their graduate research had identified several specific locations where Torino's companies were disposing of hazardous materials from construction sites, chemical plants, and manufacturing facilities throughout South Florida, and their soil samples contained evidence that could have resulted in criminal prosecutions, massive financial penalties, and the complete shutdown of the illegal operation. More dangerously, from Torino's perspective, their research had also documented the pattern of regulatory failures that allowed the illegal dumping to continue unchecked, which could have exposed the corruption network that protected his organization from law enforcement scrutiny. Federal investigators discovered that Sarah and David had been under surveillance for weeks before their disappearance, with Torino's security team monitoring their movement, intercepting their phone calls, and even infiltrating their academic department to gain advance warning of their research findings. The couple had been marked for elimination as soon as Torino's people realized that their environmental research posed an existential threat to the entire criminal enterprise. The investigation revealed that the night of August 17, 1989, had been carefully planned as a routine elimination operation with multiple backup plans to ensure that Sarah and David would disappear without leaving any trace that could be connected to Torino's organization. Surveillance teams had been tracking the couple's weekend trip to Lake Okeechobee, waiting for an opportunity to intercept them in a location remote enough that their disappearance could be attributed to the many dangers of the Everglades wilderness. The operation involved at least 6 members of Torino's organization, including professional killers, boat operators, and cleanup specialists who were experienced in making bodies disappear in the vast maze of waterways that crisscrossed the region. Federal wiretaps captured conversations between various members of the organization discussing the need to eliminate the college kids who were asking too many questions about the wrong business deal, though the participants were careful to avoid mentioning specific names or locations could be used as evidence in criminal trials. The operation had been personally approved by Torino himself, who viewed the murders as a necessary investment in protecting a business that was generating more than $10 million per year in profits from illegal dumping contracts. The corruption network that protected Torino's organization was revealed to be even more extensive than initially suspected, with compromised officials at every level of government, from local police department to federal regulatory agency. Officer Marcus Webb, who had initially dismissed the missing persons report with suspicious indifference, was discovered to have received regular payments from Torino associates in exchange for providing advance warning of police investigation and ensuring that evidence from environmental crimes would be lost or contaminated before it could be used in prosecution. Detective Ray Castellanos realized that his investigation had been sabotaged from the beginning by supervisors who were either directly corrupt or intimidated by threats from Torino's organization, explaining why crucial evidence had repeatedly disappeared and why promising leads had been abandoned without follow-up. The systematic obstruction had been so thorough that federal investigators concluded it would have been impossible for any local law enforcement agency to solve the case without outside assistance, since every aspect of the investigation was being monitored and controlled by the same criminal organization that had ordered the murders. Even more disturbing, the investigation revealed that Sarah and David were not Torino's only victims, but rather part of a pattern of eliminations that had been ongoing for more than a decade, with environmental activists, whistleblowing employees, and honest government officials disappearing whenever they posed a threat to the illegal dumping operation. As Operation Everglades continued to gather evidence through wiretaps, financial analysis, and cooperation from lower-level criminals who agreed to testify in exchange for reduced sentences, federal investigators began to identify the specific individual who had been involved in planning and executing the murders of Sarah Martinez and David Chen. The case had become a federal priority not just because of the environmental crimes, but because the systematic corruption of law enforcement represented a direct threat to the rule of law in South Florida, with implications that extended far beyond the fate of 2 graduate students who had been in the wrong place at the wrong time. The investigation revealed that Torino's organization had essentially created a criminal state within the state, with their own courts, police, and execution squads that operated with impunity because they had purchased the cooperation or silence of the officials who should have been prosecuting them. Federal agents realized that solving the Sarah Martinez and David Chen case would require dismantling an entire criminal network that had been protected by corruption for more than 15 years, but they also understood that success would send a message to other organized crime groups that no level of political protection could shield them from federal prosecution if they targeted innocent civilians. The stage was being set for a confrontation between federal law enforcement and one of the most sophisticated criminal organizations in American history, with the fate of two young environmental researchers serving as the catalyst for a legal battle that would determine whether justice could still prevail against corruption that had infected every level of government. In 2008, Operation Everglades entered its most intensive phase when federal agents received authorization to conduct round-the-clock surveillance of Vincent Torino and his key associates using advanced electronic monitoring equipment that could track their movement, record their conversations, and analyze their financial transactions in real time. The surveillance operation required coordination between multiple federal agencies, with FBI agents handling the criminal investigation, EPA specialists focusing on the environmental crimes, and IRS investigators tracking the money laundering schemes that allowed Torino's organization to legitimize their illegal profits. Advanced GPS tracking devices were secretly installed on vehicles used by suspected members of the criminal network, while sophisticated listening devices were placed in their homes, office, and favorite restaurant through covert operations that required months of careful planning and execution. The technological capabilities available to federal investigators in 2008 far exceeded anything that had been available during the initial investigation of Sarah and David's disappearance, allowing agents to gather evidence that would have been impossible to obtain using the primitive surveillance methods of the late 1980s and early 90s. The surveillance operation was so comprehensive that federal agents could monitor virtually every aspect of the criminal organization's activities, but the challenge was gathering evidence that would be admissible in court while avoiding detection of security-conscious criminals who routinely swept their premises for electronic surveillance. The breakthrough came when surveillance revealed that Torino was planning to eliminate another potential witness, Dr. Resnamo. Elena Rodriguez, an environmental scientist who had begun asking uncomfortable questions about illegal dumping sites that her research team had discovered during a federally funded study of water quality in the Everglades. Federal agents learned that Dr. Rodriguez had unknowingly replicated much of the research that Sarah Martinez and David Chen had been conducting nearly 20 years earlier, identifying the same contamination patterns and regulatory failures that had cost the young couple their lives. Torino's organization had placed Dr. Rodriguez under surveillance and was making preparations to arrange her disappearance in a way that would appear to be an accidental drowning during one of her field research expeditions, using the same methods that had been successfully employed against previous targets. Federal agents realized that they had an opportunity to prevent another murder while gathering direct evidence of Torino's methods, but the operation would require split-second timing and perfect coordination to avoid alerting the criminal organization that they were under federal investigation. The decision was made to allow the plot against Dr. Rodriguez to proceed to the point where arrests could be made with irrefutable evidence, while ensuring that she would be protected by undercover agents posing as research assistants who could intervene if the situation became dangerous. The surveillance operation revealed the sophisticated methods that Torino's organization used to plan and execute elimination, including detailed reconnaissance of potential targets, careful selection of locations where bodies could be disposed of without detection, and elaborate schemes to create plausible alternative explanations for their victims' disappearances. Federal agents discovered that the organization maintained detailed files on dozens of potential targets, including environmental activists, honest government officials, and journalists who had shown interest in investigating illegal dumping operations throughout South Florida. The files contained personal information about the target's daily routines, family relationships, financial situations, and psychological profiles that could be used to determine the most effective methods for eliminating them without arousing suspicion. More chillingly, the files also contained photographs, floor plan, and tactical assessment that demonstrated the organization's capability to strike at targets in their homes, offices, or anywhere else they might feel safe from retaliation. The level of detail and professional planning revealed that Torino's organization operated like a military unit rather than a traditional criminal enterprise, with specialized teams responsible for surveillance, planning, execution, and cleanup operations that left no evidence connecting the victims' deaths to organized crime. Electronic surveillance captured crucial conversations between Torino and his top lieutenants discussing the specific methods that had been used to eliminate Sarah Martinez and David Chen, including details about the location where their bodies had been disposed of and the techniques used to ensure that the remains would never be discovered by conventional search methods. The conversations were recorded during a series of meetings at Torino's private residence, where he felt secure enough to speak openly about past operations, planning future elimination. Federal agents learned that the couple had been intercepted on the remote stretch of highway by a team of gunmen who forced them off the road and transferred them to a boat that transported them to a processing facility deep in the Everglades, where they were tortured for information about their research before being killed, and their bodies dissolved in industrial acid obtained from Torino's legitimate construction business. The location of the processing facility was revealed to be an abandoned fish camp that had been purchased through shell companies controlled by Torino's organization and converted into a sophisticated operation for eliminating witnesses and disposing of evidence. The facility included holding cells, interrogation room, and industrial equipment for disposing of bodies and other evidence, representing a level of criminal sophistication that exceeded anything federal agents had previously encountered in organized crime investigations. The surveillance also revealed the extent of corruption within law enforcement and government agencies, recorded conversations identifying specific officials who had been purchased by Torino's organization to provide protection from criminal execution. Federal agents discovered that the corruption network included judges who dismissed cases on technical grounds, prosecutors who refused to pursue charges despite overwhelming evidence, and police officials who ensured that investigation be sabotaged within the responsible for conducting them. The recorded conversations included discussions of specific payments made to corrupt officials, detailed descriptions of how evidence was destroyed or contaminated to prevent successful prosecution, and planning sessions for future bribes and intimidation tactics to maintain the organization's protection from law enforcement scrutiny. More disturbing still, the surveillance revealed that some corrupt officials had actively participated in planning elimination, providing inside information about witnesses who were cooperating with investigations, and suggesting methods for making their deaths appear accidental or unrelated to organized crime activity. The scope of the corruption was so extensive that federal agents realized they would need to build cases against dozens of public officials, in addition to the members of Torino's criminal organization, requiring a level of resources and coordination that would strain the capabilities of multiple federal agencies. As the surveillance operation continued into 2009, federal agents began identifying the specific individuals who had participated in the murders of Sarah Martinez and David Chen, including the gunmen who had intercepted them on the highway, the boat operators who had transported them to the process facility, and the specialists who had disposed of their bodies using methods that ensured no physical evidence would ever be recovered. The investigation revealed that most of these individuals were still alive and actively involved, having participated in numerous other eliminations while feeling secure in their protection. Federal agents realized that building a successful case would require convincing one or more of these hardened criminals to cooperate with federal authorities, but the organization's reputation for eliminating anyone who betrayed its secrets made it extremely difficult to find individuals willing to risk their lives by testifying against Torino and his associates. The breakthrough would come when federal agents identified a vulnerability in one of Torino's key lieutenants, a man whose personal circumstances made him susceptible to pressure that could force him to choose between cooperation with federal authority and certain death at the hands of his. The stage was being set for the final phase of Operation Everglades, a carefully orchestrated operation that would either result in justice for Sarah Martinez and David Chen, or demonstrate that some criminal organizations had become too powerful and well protected to be defeated by conventional law enforcement methods. On March 15, 2010, federal agents executed a carefully coordinated operation to arrest Antonio "Tony" Salvatore, Vincent Torino's chief of operations, and the man responsible for planning and supervising the elimination of witnesses who threatened the organization's illegal dumping operation. Salvatore had been identified through months of surveillance as the individual who had personally overseen the murders of Sarah Martinez and David Chen, and federal agents had gathered enough evidence to charge him with multiple counts of murder, racketeering, and conspiracy to obstruct justice. The arrest was timed to coincide with Salvatore's weekly visit to his elderly mother in a Miami nursing home. One of the few locations followed a predictable routine that made him vulnerable to capture by federal agents who had been patiently waiting for the right opportunity. The operation involved more than 30 FBI agents with surveillance teams positioned throughout the neighborhood to prevent Salvatore's escape and backup units ready to respond if the arrest triggered retaliation from other members of Torino's organization. Salvatore was taken into custody without incident as he left the nursing home, but the expression of shock and fear on his face made it clear that he understood the significance of his arrest and the implications for his future survival, since cooperation with federal authorities would make him a target for elimination by his former associate. Refusal to cooperate would likely result in a life sentence in federal prison. The arrest of Antonio Salvatore sent shockwaves through Torino's criminal organization as surveillance intercepts revealed panicked conversations between various members who realized that their chief operations officer possessed detailed knowledge about virtually every aspect of their illegal activities over the past 20 years. Federal agents had deliberately chosen to arrest Salvatore first because his central role in the organization meant that he could provide evidence against dozens of other criminals and corrupt officials, but they also knew that his capture would trigger desperate attempts by Torino's organization to either rescue him or eliminate him before he could testify against them. Within hours of the arrest, surveillance detected unusual activity at several locations associated with the criminal network, including emergency meetings at safe houses, suspicious financial transactions that suggested preparation for flight, and communications between Torino's associates and corrupt law enforcement officials who were attempting to determine the extent of federal knowledge about their activities. The organization's response to Salvatore's arrest confirmed federal agents' assessment that he was indeed a crucial figure whose cooperation could lead to the complete dismantling of the criminal network, but it also demonstrated the lengths to which Torino would go to protect his empire from federal prosecution. Salvatore's initial interrogation revealed a man who had spent decades insulating himself from the consequences of his action through a combination of careful planning, political protection, and ruthless elimination of anyone who posed a threat to his security. He had joined Torino's organization as a young man in the 1980s and had gradually worked his way up through the ranks by demonstrating exceptional skill in planning complex operations and maintaining absolute secrecy about the organization's activity. His role as chief of operations had given him direct involvement in more than 50 eliminations over the past 2 decades, including environmental activists, government whistleblowers, journalists, and honest law enforcement officers who had attempted to investigate illegal dumping operations throughout South Florida. Federal agents presented him with overwhelming evidence of his involvement in these crimes, including recorded conversations, financial records, and witness testimony from lower-level criminals who had already agreed to cooperate with the investigation in exchange for reduced sentences. The evidence was so comprehensive that Salvatore's experienced criminal defense attorney advised him that conviction was virtually certain and that his only hope for avoiding a death sentence lay in cooperating fully with federal authorities and providing testimony that could lead to the prosecution of Vincent Torino and the other leaders of the criminal organization. The psychological pressure applied to Salvatore was carefully calibrated to exploit his personal vulnerabilities while offering genuine incentives for cooperation that would make betraying his former associates seem like a rational choice rather than an act of desperation. Federal agents had discovered that Salvatore's greatest fear was not death itself, but rather the prospect of dying slowly and painfully at the hands of Torino's professional killers, who had a reputation for making examples of traitors through particularly brutal execution methods. They also learned that Salvatore had been quietly skimming money from the organization's illegal dumping operations for years, accumulating a secret nest egg that he had been planning to use for retirement in a foreign country with no extradition treaty with the United States. The revelation of his financial betrayal of Torino's organization provided federal agents with additional leverage, since they could credibly threaten to reveal his theft to his former associates while offering witness protection and a chance to keep a portion of his stolen funds in exchange for comprehension. More importantly, federal agents discovered that Salvatore had been secretly recording conversations with Torino and other members of the organization as insurance against future betrayal, creating a treasure trove of evidence that could be used to prosecute the entire criminal network if he could be convinced to turn over the recordings and testify about them. The negotiations between federal agents and Salvatore's defense team continued for weeks, with both sides carefully maneuvering to the best possible outcome for their respective interests, while dealing with the constant threat that Torino's organization might attempt to eliminate Salvatore before he could provide damaging. Federal agents offered Salvatore a plea agreement that would spare him from the death penalty and provide witness protection for himself and his immediate family members, but they also made it clear that the offer was contingent upon his complete cooperation and his willingness to testify against Vincent Torino and other high-ranking members of the criminal organization. The psychological pressure on Salvatore intensified when federal agents revealed that they had intercepted communications indicating that Torino had already ordered his elimination and was making preparation to carry out the execution as soon as an opportunity presented. Salvatore realized that his former associates viewed him as an unacceptable security risk, regardless of whether he cooperated with federal authorities, meaning that his only chance for survival lay in accepting witness protection and helping to destroy the organization that was now planning to kill him. The decision to cooperate was ultimately made easier by Salvatore's recognition that federal agents possessed enough evidence to convict him of multiple capital crimes even without his testimony, making coercion his only hope for avoiding execution by either the federal government or his former criminal. On April 3, 2010, Antonio Salvatore signed a comprehensive cooperation agreement with federal prosecutors and began providing detailed information about the structure and operation of Vincent Torino's criminal organization, including specific details about the murders of Sarah Martinez and David Chen that had remained unsolved for more than 20 years. The cooperation agreement required Salvatore to submit to extensive debriefing sessions with federal agents, undergo polygraph examinations to verify the accuracy of his statements, and provide access to the secret recordings he had made of conversations with Torino. And federal agents realized that Salvatore's cooperation represented an unprecedented opportunity to solve dozens of unsolved murders and disappearances, while dismantling one of the most sophisticated criminal organizations in American history. But they also understood that the success of their investigation would depend upon their ability to protect Salvatore from retaliation long enough for him to provide testimony in federal. The cooperation agreement marked the beginning of the final phase of Operation Everglades, as federal agents prepared to use Salvatore's information to execute simultaneous arrests of Vincent Torino and dozens of his associates while gathering the evidence needed to prosecute corrupt officials who had protected the criminal organization for more than 2 decades. The long-delayed quest for justice for Sarah Martinez and David Chen was finally approaching its climax, but the outcome would depend upon the federal government's ability to overcome the political influence and criminal sophistication of an organization that had successfully evaded prosecution for more than 20 years. Antonio Salvatore's first detailed confession session took place at a secure federal facility on April 10, 2010, with FBI agent Linda Morrison and federal prosecutor James Crawford recording every word as the longtime criminal operations began to unravel more than 20 years of carefully guarded about Vincent Torino's. Salvatore appeared nervous but determined as he settled into the stark interrogation room, his hands trembling slightly as he accepted a cup of coffee and began the process that would either save his life or ensure his death at the hands of former associates who had already marked him for a limb. The confession began with Salvatore's admission that he had personally planned and supervised the murders of Sarah Martinez and David Chen on August 17, 1989, describing the operation as one of dozens of similar eliminations he had orchestrated over the years to protect Torino's illegal dumping empire from exposure by environmental researchers, government investigators, and honest law enforcement officers. His voice was steady but haunted as he explained that the young couple had been specifically targeted because their graduate research had identified contamination patterns that could have led to criminal prosecutions, massive financial penalties, and the complete shutdown of illegal operations that were generating millions of dollars in annual profits for Torino's organization. The decision to eliminate them had been made personally by Vincent Torino after receiving reports from surveillance teams that the couple's research posed an existential threat to the entire criminal enterprise, and Salvatore had been given carte blanche to plan an operation that would ensure their permanent disappearance without leaving any evidence that could be traced to organized crime. The confession revealed the chilling efficiency with which Torino's organization had planned and executed the murders, beginning with weeks of surveillance that had mapped every aspect of Sarah and David's daily routines, personal relationships, and academic research activity. Salvatore described how the organization had infiltrated the University of Miami's Environmental Science Department through a graduate student who was secretly working for Torino, providing advance intelligence about the couple's research finding and their plans for field work in the Everglades. The surveillance had revealed that Sarah and David frequently took weekend trips to remote locations for their research, creating opportunities for elimination that could be disguised as accidents or random encounters with criminals who used the wilderness as a base of operation. The specific plan for August 17, 1989, had been developed after surveillance teams confirmed that the couple would be traveling alone on isolated roads through areas where Torino's organization could operate without fear of witnesses or interference from law enforcement. Salvatore's confession included detailed descriptions of the weapons, vehicles, and equipment that had been assembled for the operation, as well as the specific roles assigned to each member of the execution team that had been carefully selected based on their experience in previous eliminations and their absolute loyalty to the organization. The most harrowing portion of Salvatore's confession dealt with the actual events of the night when Sarah Martinez and David Chen were murdered, as he provided a minute-by-minute account of how the operation had been carried out with military precision and ruthless efficiency. According to Salvatore's testimony, the couple had been intercepted at approximately 10:15 p.m. as they drove through a particularly desolate stretch of the Tamiami Trail, where members of his team had created a fake accident scene using a disabled vehicle and emergency flares to force them to stop and offer assistance. Sarah had been driving when they encountered the staged accident, and both she and David had gotten out of their car to help what they believed were stranded motorists, displaying the kind of compassionate instincts that had made them easy targets for predators who had no qualms about exploiting human decency for criminal purposes. The couple had been quickly overpowered by armed men who emerged from concealment in the surrounding vegetation, bound with restraints that had been prepared in advance, and loaded onto an airboat that transported them through the dark waterways of the Everglades to an abandoned fish camp that served as Torino's organization's primary facility for interrogating and eliminating witnesses. Salvatore's voice became increasingly strained as he described the couple's terror and confusion during the boat ride, explaining that they had repeatedly asked why they were being kidnapped and pleaded for their release, apparently believing that they had been targeted for robbery or some other conventional crime that might end with their survival if they cooperated with captors' demands. The confession revealed that Sarah and David had been held at the processing facility for nearly 6 hours while Salvatore's team attempted to determine the full extent of their research and whether they had shared their findings with other people who might continue their investigation. Salvatore described the systematic torture that had been used to extract information from the couple, including psychological intimidation, physical abuse, and threats against their families that were designed to break down the resistance and ensure complete cooperation with their interrogation. Sarah had initially tried to protect David by claiming that she was the primary researcher and that he had only limited knowledge of their findings, but the interrogation had eventually revealed the full scope of their work and the specific contamination sites that they had identified through their environmental sampling and analysis. David had attempted to negotiate for their release by offering to destroy their research and abandon their graduate studies, apparently still hoping that their captors were rational criminals who would be satisfied with eliminating the threat to their operations without resorting to murder. The interrogation had continued until Salvatore was satisfied that he had identified all of the people who knew about the couple's research and all of the locations where evidence of their findings might be stored, ensuring that their elimination would completely end the threat to Torino's illegal dumping operations without leaving any loose ends that might eventually lead to criminal prosecution. Salvatore's description of the actual murders was delivered in a flat, emotionless tone that made the brutality of the crimes even more disturbing, as he explained the methods that had been used to ensure that the couple's deaths would be swift, but that their bodies would never be recovered by law enforcement or family members searching for closure. According to his testimony, Sarah and David had been executed separately, with Sarah being forced to watch David's murder as a final psychological torture before she was killed in the same manner, using methods that Salvatore declined to describe in detail, but which had been specifically chosen to ensure rapid death without the noise or mess that might attract unwanted attention from other people in the area. The bodies had been immediately processed using industrial acid obtained from Torino's legitimate construction businesses, with the remains being dissolved completely and the resulting liquid waste being disposed of in deep water locations that would ensure no physical evidence could ever be recovered through conventional search methods. Salvatore explained that this disposal method had been perfected through years of experience with previous elimination and represented the most reliable way to ensure that victims would simply vanish without a trace, leaving law enforcement with no physical evidence to investigate and families with no remains to bury or memorialize. The couple's personal belongings had been carefully sorted, with some items being planted at the location where their abandoned car was discovered to create the impression that they had been victims of random criminals, while other possessions had been destroyed to eliminate any evidence that might eventually lead investigators back to Torino's organization. The psychological impact of delivering his confession was clearly taking its toll on Salvatore, whose composed demeanor began to crack as he described the aftermath of the murders and the systematic cover-up that had protected the organization from investigation for more than 20 years. He admitted that the elimination of Sarah Martinez and David Chen had been one of his most challenging operations, not because of any technical difficulty, but because the couple's youth and obvious innocence had made it difficult to maintain the emotional detachment that was necessary for carrying out crimes without being consumed by guilt and remorse. Salvatore revealed that he had suffered recurring nightmares about the murders for years afterward, but that his fear of Vincent Torino and his loyalty to the organization had prevented him from showing any signs of weakness or regret that might be interpreted as security. The confession session concluded with Salvatore's acknowledgement that his testimony would likely result in death sentence for himself and his associates, but that his decision to cooperate with federal authorities represented his only chance to achieve some measure of redemption for crimes that had haunted him for more than 2 decades. Federal agents realized that they now possessed detailed information needed to solve one of Florida's most notorious unsolved cases, but they also understood that Salvatore's testimony would need to be corroborated through physical evidence and additional witnesses if they hoped to successful execution against Vincent Torino and the other members of his criminal organization. Salvatore's subsequent confession sessions revealed the sophisticated methods that Torino's organization had used to obstruct the investigation from the very beginning, demonstrating a level of criminal cunning that had successfully manipulated law enforcement agencies for more than 2 decades. The cover-up had begun even before Sarah and David's bodies had been fully disposed of, with corrupt police officials receiving detailed instructions about how to handle the missing persons report in ways that would prevent any serious investigation from developing. Officer Marcus Webb had been specifically chosen to take the initial report because of his established history of cooperation with Torino's organization, and his dismissive attitude toward the family's concerns had been carefully calculated to delay the start of any meaningful search effort until the organization had time to complete the cleanup of evidence from the crime scene. Salvatore revealed that Webb had a $50,000 payment role in the cover-up, along with threats against his family that ensured his continued cooperation even after he retired and moved away from. The systematic corruption of the initial investigation had been so thorough that federal agents realized virtually every aspect of the early police work had been compromised, from the contamination of physical evidence to the mysterious disappearance of witness statement might have provided crucial leads for honest investigation. The cover-up had extended far beyond the corruption of individual police officers to encompass a coordinated campaign of disinformation and evidence destruction that had involved corrupt officials at multiple levels of government throughout South Florida. Salvatore described how Torino's organization had maintained detailed files on hundreds of public officials, documenting their personal and financial vulnerabilities that could be exploited through bribery, blackmail, or intimidation to ensure their cooperation with criminal activities. The organization had systematically placed their associates in key positions throughout law enforcement agencies, regulatory bodies, and court system, creating a network of corruption that could protect their operations from investigation while eliminating anyone who posed a threat to their security. Judges had been purchased to ensure that cases against the organization would be dismissed on technical grounds. Prosecutors had been compromised to guarantee that charges would never be filed despite overwhelming evidence, and evidence technicians had been corrupted to ensure that crucial physical evidence would be lost or contaminated before it could be analyzed. The scope of the corruption was so extensive that Salvatore estimated more than 200 public officials had received payments from Torino's organization over the years, making it virtually impossible for any local law enforcement agents to conduct an honest investigation into the organization's activities without having their efforts sabotaged within. The confession revealed specific details about how crucial evidence from the Sarah Martinez and David Chen case had been systematically destroyed or contaminated to prevent successful prosecution of the organization's members. Salvatore explained that corrupt evidence technicians had been instructed to ensure that fingerprints from the abandoned car would be smudged beyond recognition, that soil samples from the crime scene would be contaminated with materials that would make forensic analysis impossible, and that photographs of tire tracks and other physical evidence would be deliberately misfiled or destroyed through convenient storage access. The couple's personal belongings that should have been preserved for DNA analysis had been handled without gloves by numerous officers, ensuring that any trace evidence would be hopelessly contaminated, while witness statements from people who might have seen suspicious activity in the area had been altered or simply never entered into official case files. Even more disturbing, Salvatore revealed that some evidence had been deliberately planted to support false theories about the couple's disappearance, including items that suggested they had been victims of drug smugglers or other criminals who had no connection to environmental crime or illegal dumping operations. The manipulation of evidence had been so sophisticated that even honest investigators would have found it extremely difficult to distinguish between legitimate clues and deliberate red herrings designed to lead them away from the truth about Torino's involvement in the murders. Salvatore's testimony also revealed the methods that had been used to intimidate or eliminate witnesses who might have provided information that could have led to demonstrating the organization's willingness to commit additional crimes to protect their secrets from exposure. Several potential witnesses had been identified through the organization's surveillance network and had been systematically intimidated through anonymous threats, suspicious accidents, or financial pressure that convinced them to remain silent about anything they might have observed on the night of the murder. A fisherman who had reported seeing unusual boat traffic in the area around the time of the disappearance, had been visited by men who made it clear that his continued cooperation with police would result in harm to his family, while a convenience store clerk who might have seen the couple's car being followed by suspicious vehicles had been offered a large sum of money to relocate to another state and forget about anything he might have witnessed. More ominously, at least 3 people who had attempted to provide information to investigators had died in circumstances that appeared accidental, but which Salvatore revealed had been carefully orchestrated eliminations designed to send a message to other potential witnesses about the consequences of cooperating with law enforcement. The systematic intimidation and elimination of witnesses had been so effective that by the time federal agents began their investigation more than 15 years later, virtually all of the people who might have provided crucial testimony were either dead, missing, or too frightened to come forward with information that could have solved the case. The cover-up had also involved a sophisticated disinformation campaign designed to discredit the family's efforts to keep the case in the public eye and maintain pressure on law enforcement agencies to continue their investigation. Salvatore described how Torino's organization had planted false stories in local media, suggesting that Sarah and David had been involved in illegal activities that might have led to their disappearance, including rumors about drug dealing, gambling debts, and romantic entanglement that would have provided alternative motive. Private investigators hired by the families had been deliberately fed false information that led them on expensive, wild goose chase. Genuine leads that might have advanced the investigation were suppressed through the organization's network of corrupt officials and intimidated witnesses. The families themselves had been subjected to subtle harassment and surveillance designed to discourage their continued pursuit of justice, including anonymous phone calls, suspicious break-ins at their homes, and financial pressure applied through the organization's connections in the business community. Even more cruelly, the organization had occasionally provided false hope to the grieving families by arranging for bogus confessions and fabricated evidence that would briefly revive their optimism before being revealed as hoaxes, creating an emotional roller coaster that was designed to exhaust their resources and break their determination to seek justice for their murdered children. The most chilling aspect of Salvatore's confession was his revelation that the cover-up of Sarah and David's murders had been used as a template for concealing dozens of other eliminations carried out by Torino's organization over the past, demonstrating that the couple's case was just one example of a systematic pattern of corruption that had allowed organized crime to operate with virtual impunity throughout South Florida. Salvatore provided detailed information about at least 30 other murders that had been disguised as accidents, suicides, or disappearance, including environmental activists, honest government officials, journalists, and even some members of Torino's own organization who had been eliminated when they became security risks or attempted to leave the criminal enterprise. The methods used to cover up these crimes had been refined experience, with each successful obstruction of justice providing lessons applied to future operations to ensure that the organization's involvement would never be detected by law. Federal agents realized that Salvatore's cooperation would not only solve the Sarah Martinez and David Chen case, but would also provide the evidence needed to prosecute Torino's organization for what amounted to a decades-long reign of terror that had corrupted the entire criminal justice throughout the region. The confession had revealed the existence of a criminal conspiracy so extensive and sophisticated that it challenged fundamental assumptions about the ability of organized crime to operate within American society. But it had also provided federal authorities with the information they needed to finally bring Vincent Torino and his associates to justice after more than 20 years of successful evasion of the law. On November 15, 2010, federal agents executed simultaneous arrests of Vincent Torino and 47 members of his criminal organization in a coordinated operation that spanned 3 states and involved more than 200 law enforcement officers from multiple agencies. The arrests were timed to begin at precisely 6:00 a.m. to maximize the element of surprise and minimize the risk that any of the targets would be warned by corrupt officials who might still be sympathetic to the organization, though federal agents had taken extensive precautions to ensure that Details of the operation were known only to personnel whose loyalty had been thoroughly vetted. Torino himself was taken into custody at his waterfront mansion in Key Biscayne, where he had been enjoying his morning coffee on a terrace overlooking Biscayne Bay, apparently confident that his network of corrupt officials would provide advance warning of any law enforcement action directed against his organization. The expression of shock and disbelief on his face as federal agents placed him in handcuffs made it clear that he had never seriously considered the possibility that his criminal empire might be vulnerable to prosecution. Despite the obvious risks inherent in operating such an extensive illegal enterprise for more than 2 decades, surveillance footage of the arrest showed a man who had grown accustomed to wielding enormous power and influence suddenly reduced to the status of a common criminal, his carefully cultivated image of respectability shattered by the reality of federal charges that could result in multiple life sentences or even execution for the murders he had ordered. The evidence gathered through Operation Everglades and Antonio Salvatore's cooperation was so comprehensive that federal prosecutors were able to file charges against the defendants for more than 150 separate criminal counts, including murder, racketeering, conspiracy, money laundering, environmental crimes, and corruption of public. The indictments revealed the staggering scope of Torino's criminal enterprise, which had generated an estimated $500 million in illegal profits over the past 20 years, while systematically corrupting law enforcement and regulatory agencies throughout South Florida. In addition to the murders of Sarah Martinez and David Chen, the charges included at least 30 other homicides that had been disguised as accidents or random crime, along with environmental violations had contaminated thousands of acres of protected wetland with toxic waste and dangerous for centuries. The financial crimes alone were sufficient to justify seizure of virtually all assets controlled by Torino and his associates, including legitimate businesses, real estate holdings, and bank accounts in multiple countries that had been used to launder the proceeds from illegal dumping operations. Federal agents estimated that the total value of assets subject to forfeiture exceeded $200 million, representing one of the largest seizures in the history of organized crime prosecutions, and ensuring that even defendants who avoided conviction would be financially destroyed by the legal proceedings. The prosecution of Vincent Torino and his associates required unprecedented security measures due to the organization's history of eliminating witnesses and the obvious incentives for attempting to silence Antonio Salvatore before he could testify in federal court. Salvatore and his immediate family members were placed in a witness protection program that relocated them to an undisclosed location with new identities and around-the-clock security provided by federal marshals who had been specifically trained to deal with threats from sophisticated criminal organizations. The trial proceedings were conducted in a specially secured federal courthouse with metal detectors, armed guards, and restrictions on public access that were designed to prevent any attempts at intimidation or violence by supporters of the defendants or corrupt officials who might still be loyal to Torino's organization. Judge Patricia Williams, who was assigned to oversee the complex proceedings, had previously handled high-profile terrorism cases and was experienced in dealing with the unique challenges posed by defendants who possessed both the motivation and resources to threaten the integrity. The jury selection process took more than 3 months due to the extensive screening required to identify citizens who had not been influenced by the organization's propaganda efforts and who could be trusted to render verdicts based solely on the evidence presented in court. Salvatore's testimony during the trial provided the most detailed public account ever presented of how organized crime had systematically corrupted law enforcement and government agencies to protect illegal operations that generated enormous profits while devastating the environment, terrorizing honest citizens. His description of the murders of Sarah Martinez and David Chen was delivered over the course of 3 days, with prosecutors carefully leading him through every aspect of the planning and execution of the crimes, while defense attorneys attempted to discredit him by highlighting his obvious self-interest in cooperating with federal authorities. The emotional impact of Salvatore's testimony was heightened by the presence in the courtroom of the victims' families, who were finally learning the truth about what had happened to their children more than 20 years after their disappearance, though the graphic details of the torture and murder were almost too painful for them to endure. Media coverage of the trial was extensive, with daily reports that shocked the public and revealed the extent to which organized crime had been able to operate with impunity due to systematic corruption that had infected every level of government throughout the region. The testimony also revealed the names of dozens of corrupt officials who had protected Torino's organization, leading to additional investigations and prosecution that would continue for years after the main trial concluded. The recovery of physical evidence that corroborated Salvatore's testimony provided crucial support for the prosecution's case, and finally gave the families some measure of closure after more than 2 decades of uncertainty about the fate of their loved one. Federal agents used Salvatore's detailed information about the location of the processing to conduct extensive searches of the abandoned fish camp where Sarah and David had been tortured and murdered, recovering trace evidence including DNA samples, metal fragments from the acid disposal process, and personal items that had belonged to multiple victims of Torino's organization. The discovery of human remains at several disposal sites identified by Salvatore allowed forensic specialists to confirm the identities of at least 12 murder victims through dental records and DNA analysis, though the condition of the remains made it impossible to recover anything that could be returned to families for burial. More importantly, from a legal perspective, the physical evidence provided independent confirmation of Salvatore's testimony about the methods used by the organization to eliminate witnesses and dispose of evidence, making it much more difficult for attorneys to argue the operation agreement had motivated him to fabricate or exaggerate the crime. The combination of Salvatore's detailed testimony and corroborating physical evidence created an overwhelming case that even experienced defense attorneys acknowledged would be extremely difficult to overcome, leading several defendants to enter into plea agreements rather than risk conviction on charges that could result. The verdicts in the case were delivered on March 17, 2012, after jury deliberations that lasted only 4 days despite the complexity of the charges and the massive amount of evidence that had been presented during the 6-month trial. Vincent Torino was convicted on all counts and sentenced to death for his role in ordering the murders of Sarah Martinez, David Chen, and multiple other victims, while his key associates received sentences ranging from life in prison without the possibility of parole to terms of 25 to 50 years for their roles in the criminal organization. The sentences reflected not only the severity of the crimes themselves, but also the systematic corruption of government institutions that had allowed the organization to operate with impunity for more than 2 decades, while terrorizing honest citizens and devastating the environment throughout South Florida. Judge Williams specifically noted in her sentencing remarks that the defendants had betrayed the public trust by corrupting law enforcement and regulatory agencies, making their crimes even more heinous than typical organized crime activities because they had undermined the very institutions that citizens depend upon for protection from criminal predators. The successful prosecution of Torino's organization sent a message to other criminal enterprises that federal law enforcement possessed both the resources and determination to penetrate even the most sophisticated corruption network. Though prosecutors acknowledged rebuilding public trust in government institutions would require years of continued effort to identify and prosecute corrupt officials who had made such extensive criminal operations possible. The conclusion of the trial brought a complex mixture of relief, grief, and bitter satisfaction to the families of Sarah Martinez and David Chen, who had spent more than 20 years searching for answers about their loved one's fate while being systematically misled by corrupt officials who were secretly protecting the very criminals responsible for the murders. Roberto Martinez, now in his 70s and visibly aged by decades of stress and uncertainty, broke down in tears as he listened to Judge Williams read Vincent Torino's death sentence, finally receiving the justice he had fought for since that terrible night in August 1989 when his daughter had simply vanished into the darkness of the Everglades. His wife, Maria, who had suffered multiple hospitalization anxiety disorders triggered by their prolonged ordeal, sat quietly in the courtroom, holding a photograph of Sarah taken during her graduation college, her silence more eloquent than any words could have been, expressing a profound sense of loss that would never be fully healed, regardless of the legal. David's parents, Dr. James Chen and his wife Linda, had maintained their composure throughout the trial proceedings, but were visibly shaken by the detailed testimony about their son's final hours, learning for the first time about the courage he had shown in attempting to protect Sarah even while facing torture and certain death at the hands of Torino's professional killer. The families found some comfort in knowing that their children's deaths had not been meaningless, since the investigation triggered by their murders had ultimately led to the destruction of a criminal organization that had terrorized the region for decades and corrupted countless government institutions. The emotional impact extended far beyond the immediate families, to include law enforcement officers who had struggled for years with the knowledge that they were being prevented from doing their jobs by systematic corruption that protected criminals while denying justice to victims and their loved ones. Detective Ray Castellanos, who had never stopped believing that Sarah and David's case could be solved despite official pressure to abandon the investigation, felt vindicated by the successful prosecution, but also profoundly saddened by the realization that the murders could have been prevented if honest law enforcement had not been systematically obstructed by corrupt officials. FBI agent Linda Morrison, who had led Operation Everglades from its inception, described the case as both the most rewarding and most disturbing investigation of her career, since it had demonstrated both the potential for federal law enforcement to overcome even the most sophisticated criminal organizations and the horrifying extent to which corruption could undermine public safety and environmental protection. The successful prosecution presented a victory for the rule of law, but it also highlighted the vulnerability of Democrat criminal infiltration and the importance of maintaining vigilant oversight of government aid that possess the power to betray the citizens who depend upon for security and justice. Antonio Salvatore's cooperation with federal authorities had been motivated primarily by self-preservation rather than genuine remorse, but his detailed testimony had nonetheless provided the evidence needed to achieve justice for dozens of murder victims and their families who had been denied closure for decades. Federal prosecutors acknowledged that Salvatore's plea agreement, which had spared him from the death penalty in exchange for cooperation, represented a difficult compromise between the demands of justice and the practical necessity of obtaining evidence that could not have. Salvatore was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, and would spend his remaining years in protective custody due to the constant threat of retaliation from surviving members of Torino's organization or other criminal groups who viewed his cooperation as an unforgivable betrayal of their code of silence. His family members, who had also been relocated through the witnessing program, would live with new identities and the permanent knowledge that their previous lives had been destroyed by the criminal choices of a husband and father who had spent decades participating in some of the most heinous crimes in Florida history. The psychological burden of his confession would follow Salvatore for the rest of his life, but his cooperation had at least ensured that Vincent Torino and his associates would never again be able to torture and murder innocent people with impunity. The environmental damage caused by Torino's illegal dumping operations would require decades of cleanup efforts and hundreds of millions of dollars in remediation costs, but federal agencies had finally gained access to detailed information about contaminated sites that had been concealed through systematic corruption of regulatory oversight. The Environmental Protection Agency launched the largest environmental restoration project in Florida history, using funds seized from Torino's organization to begin the complex process of removing toxic waste from protected wetlands and restoring damaged ecosystems that had been poisoned by decades of illegal disposal activity. The cleanup efforts would provide some measure of vindication for Sarah Martinez and David Chen's environmental research, since their graduate studies had accurately identified the contamination patterns that were now being addressed through federal intervention, though the young researchers would never know that their work had ultimately contributed to protecting the wilderness they had loved. Their criminal Environmental groups throughout the region established scholarship funds in Sarah and David's memory, ensuring that future generations of researchers would continue their work of documenting and preventing the kind of environmental crimes that cost their lives, enriching the criminals who viewed them as nothing more than a convenient disposal. The systematic investigation of corruption revealed by Operation Everglades led to additional prosecutions of more than 60 public officials who had accepted bribes or participated in the cover-up of Torino's crimes, including judges, prosecutors, police officers, and regulatory officials whose corruption had made the criminal organization's reign of terror possible. The exposure of such widespread institutional corruption sent shockwaves throughout Florida's political establishment and led to comprehensive reforms designed to prevent similar infiltration of government agencies by organized crime in the future. New oversight mechanisms were implemented to monitor the integrity of environmental enforcement. Witness protection programs were strengthened to encourage cooperation from victims of corruption, and federal agencies were given expanded authority to investigate local law enforcement agencies that showed patterns of suspicious behavior in cases involving environmental crimes or organized criminal activity. The reforms represented a direct legacy of Sarah Martinez and David Chen's murders, ensuring that their deaths would contribute to systemic changes that would protect future generations of researchers, activists, and honest citizens from the kind of criminal predation that had destroyed their lives and traumatized their families for more than 2 decades. Despite the successful prosecution of Vincent Torino and his associates, the families of Sarah Martinez and David Chen found that closure remained elusive due to the irreversible nature of their loss and the haunting knowledge of what their children had endured during their final hours. The detailed testimony about the torture and murder had provided answers to questions that had tormented them for more than 20 years, but those answers had also created new sources of pain and trauma that would require years of counseling and psychological support to address. Roberto Martinez channeled his grief into advocacy aimed at preventing other families from experiencing similar ordeals, becoming a prominent supporter of legislation designed to protect environmental researchers and strengthen penalties for crimes against witnesses and activists who threatened criminal organizations through their work. Maria Martinez, whose mental health had been devastated by decades of uncertainty and false hope, found some peace in knowing that her daughter's research had ultimately led to important environmental protection, but she would never fully recover from the prolonged ordeal of not knowing whether Sarah might still be alive somewhere and in need of rescue. The families established a foundation dedicated to supporting the families of missing persons and environmental research, ensuring that Sarah and David's memory would be associated with positive contributions to society rather than just the tragedy of their death. The case had profound implications for law enforcement agencies throughout the United States, demonstrating both the potential for organized crime to corrupt government institutions and the effectiveness of federal intervention when local authorities proved unable or unwilling to address systematic criminal activity. The methods developed during Operation Everglades became a model for federal investigations into organized crime with environmental components, leading to similar prosecutions in other parts of the country where criminal organizations had used corruption and intimidation to protect illegal dumping operations, construction fraud, and other environmentally destructive activities. Law enforcement training programs were revised to include instruction about the sophisticated methods used by criminal organizations to identify and eliminate threats from researchers, activists, and honest government officials, while new protocols were established to protect potential witnesses and prevent the kind of evidence destruction that had initially protected Torino's organization from prosecution. The successful resolution of the case also demonstrated the importance of long-term investigations that could overcome the patient and systematic obstruction tactic employed by well-funded criminal organizations with extensive political connections. The media coverage of the trial and its aftermath helped to educate the public about the vulnerability of environmental protection systems to criminal infiltration and the importance of supporting honest research and activism that could expose illegal activities before they caused irreversible damage to natural resources and public health. Investigative journalists who had been intimidated or obstructed during earlier attempts to report on environmental crimes in South Florida were finally able to tell the complete story of how organized crime had operated with virtual impunity for decades, while systematically poisoning protected ecosystems and eliminating anyone who posed a threat to their operation. The publicity surrounding the case also encouraged other victims of similar crimes to come forward with information about unsolved cases, leading to additional investigations and prosecutions that further dismantled the network of corruption that had protected environmental criminals throughout the region. Documentary filmmakers and true crime writers produced detailed accounts of the case that would preserve the story for future generations, ensuring that the lessons learned from Sarah and David's murders would not be forgotten as public attention moved on to more recent tragedies and legal proceedings. As the years passed following the conclusion of the trial, the families found that their grief had been transformed into a different kind of pain that was more manageable but would never completely disappear, mixed with pride in their children's courage and the knowledge that their deaths entirely had purpose. Annual memorial services brought together environmental researchers, law enforcement officers, and community activists who had been inspired by Sarah and David's story to continue the work of protecting natural resources and fighting corruption that threatened public safety and environmental integrity. The scholarship programs established in their memory had supported dozens of young researchers who were carrying on their environmental studies, while the foundation created by their families had provided assistance to hundreds of other families dealing with the trauma of missing loved ones and inadequate law enforcement responses to their. The couple's former classmates and professors at the University of Miami established an environmental research center dedicated to the kind of contamination studies that had cost Sarah and David their lives, ensuring that their academic work would continue to contribute to environmental protection long after their death. Vincent Torino died in federal prison in 2018 while awaiting execution, his death from natural causes denying the families the satisfaction of seeing him pay the ultimate penalty for his crimes, but also bringing a final end to the legal proceedings that had dominated their lives for nearly a. His death was barely noticed by the media or the public, representing a stark contrast to the power and influence he had once wielded as the head of one of the most successful criminal organizations in American history. But his legacy lived on in the environmental damage that required generations to repair and the trauma experienced by the families of his many victims. The surviving members of his organization who had received life sentences continued to serve their time in federal prisons, their appeals having been exhausted and their hopes for parole permanently eliminated by the severity of their crimes and the comprehensive evidence. Antonio Salvatore remained in protective custody. His cooperation saved his life, but condemned him to permanent isolation from the outside world and the constant knowledge that his former associate kill him instant if they ever gained access. The case of Sarah Martinez and David Chen ultimately became a landmark in the history of federal law enforcement's battle against organized crime, demonstrating that even the most sophisticated criminal organizations could be defeated through patient investigation, technological innovation, and the courage of witnesses willing to risk their lives to seek justice for innocent victims. The environmental protections that resulted from their murders helped to preserve thousands of acres of critical wetlands habitat while preventing future contamination that could have caused immeasurable damage to ecosystems and public health throughout South Florida. Their story served as both a cautionary tale about the vulnerability of honest citizens to criminal predation and an inspirational example of how tragedy could ultimately lead to positive change when dedicated investigators refused to give up their pursuit of justice despite years of obstruction and corruption. More than 3 decades after that humid August night, 2 young researchers disappeared into the darkness of the Everglades. Their legacy lived on in the environmental protection, law enforcement reforms, and institutional changes that would help to prevent future victims from suffering the same while ensuring that the natural world they had loved would be better for generations to come.